This is Our Voices. I'm Mario Trimble. In order to be a place where everyone in our community feels valued and connected, we first have to ensure everyone believes they belong. Our Voices is a joint podcast production from the Colorado and Denver Bar Association's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity Joint Steering Committee. Our Voices shines a light on the unique stories, experiences, and backgrounds of our member leaders so that we can help each other walk together.
Sarah Parady is a partner at Lowrey Parady Lebsack, and she has a slew of accolades to her name, including New Trial Lawyer of the Year in 2017 by the Colorado Trial Lawyers Association and 2017 Barrister of the Year awarded by the GLBT Center for Colorado. She is also a former president of the Colorado Women's Bar Association. But in this podcast, she not only discusses her upbringing and thirst for knowledge, but she also gets candid with Courtney Holm and Nicoal Sperrazza about her decision to focus away from litigation and the importance of building a strong community around you, both in work and in life.
Thank you for joining us for Our Voices. My name is Nicoal Sperrazza. I'm a solo practitioner in the Denver metro area practicing family law and civil litigation. And with me, I have a co-host.
My name is Courtney Holm. I'm an attorney and mediator in Edwards, Colorado, and I serve the mountain communities in civil litigation and criminal defense and mediation. So, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. As you know, our podcast format is to discuss who you were, who you are, and who you're going to be. And so I'd really like to delve in and start off with who you were. What got you started in the law? What was your family like? Tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up as little Sarah.
Well, my mom has a story that she likes to tell about how I used to walk around the neighborhood and go up to people and say "Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm X years old and I have blue eyes." So apparently I was not shy, which reminds me of my daughter now. So I grew up in Southwest Wyoming in a town called Rock Springs, which is primarily a mining town, lots of oil and gas, and then also coal and a mineral called trona. My dad was always in management at different mines, so first in coal and then in trona. He once won some kind of award for having been the safety manager at the most different kinds of mines, because he had done copper. It's a big deal in the West, apparently, types of mining.
I didn't know there was an award for that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but you knew it was fancy because we went up to Jackson Hole for it.
Did you go to the $1 Million Cowboy Bar?
I mean, not when I was a kid.
Fair.
My sister also later in life lived above and across from the Cowboy Bar in Laramie, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, that was my dad. That was his job. My mom was home with us when we were little and then became the head of the local children's library, which I'm always really proud of her about that. And I have to tell everybody that because she did that. She had a nursing degree, but she didn't have an associate's or a BA. And she managed to become the manager of this library just because she's amazing and really good with kids and particularly really good at puppet shows. So you guys can imagine the kind of grandma that she is. So I had my two little sisters. We always had lots of dogs, lots of kids on the block that we would run around with. We'd go into the desert and hunt lizards. It was a really, really special and nice place to grow up.
How do you hunt lizards?
I mean, yeah, that's sort of an aggressive phrasing, I suppose. But, you stalk them and catch them and keep them in a little terrarium in your basement and hope that maybe they'll shed their tail, which is the ultimate of lizard ownership.
So that's my question for you, because I used to always, quote unquote, hunt lizards when I was younger as well. But the tails would always come off. Yeah, and maybe sneaky. I was hunting them the wrong way, but how are you? I feel like that's a secret skill that you have.
No, they're smart. I mean, the little blue belly lizards will drop their tails, and then the horned toads, which we called horny toads when we were kids, do not drop their tails. So you would go after the horny toads. I don't know. We always had some in the basement in a clear plastic thing.
I think that's where I went wrong. There were always blue-bellied lizards where I was.
This is a really awesome thing to have in common. This reminds me of that party game where you try to find something unique about everyone in the room and see we're already losing at the party game.
This is certainly the only podcast where all three people have had lizards in the past because I had them in college. Marcus and Andre.
Oh, yours had names. Yeah, ours were fairly fungible.
I didn't even have a terrarium. I tried to build what I would deem a lizard resort out of mud and sand and water. And then I didn't understand why they didn't want to stay at my resort.
A lizard resort.
I know.
Well, speaking of resorts, so certainly Rock Springs is kind of a mining resort, so to speak.
That's not a thing.
That's not a thing.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I have my two sisters, Caitlin and Annalise, that I grew up with. And I now have my sister, Casey, who's 12. But back in the Wyoming days, it was me and Caitlin and Annalise.
So tell me a little bit. I have some questions about your mom, actually, because it sounds like also you're very proud of her and what she was able to do and accomplish. And I also am wondering, do you have a love of reading from growing up with a head librarian?
I mean, so she got the library job a little bit later on, but both of my parents definitely like we had a lot of books around. Somehow someone had a yard sale of this massive amount of paperbacks, and my parents just like bought them all. And I remember plowing through all of them. I was reading like these horrible, trashy romance novels when I was like 8, and I'm like, whoa, what's this about? But partly it was that we lived across the street from the library. So the library where she later worked was right across the street from us. And there was this librarian who, she was Japanese and had ended up in Rock Springs, Wyoming, I think as like a war bride, Irene Nikako, and was the head of the children's library before my mom was, and was an absolutely stern type of librarian, which is not my mom's style, but was also pretty amazing about like she would let me read sort of adult books, which typically if the kid went up to the adult part of the library, he would just get like brought back down. But Irene would like pick out things for me to read when I was really little. And she also lived like up the street from us. So she was sort of a special like person in that way. And the library where my mom ended up working was like my haunt because I could walk over there.
What was the best book that she'd picked out for you?
So I remember it was either her or my uncle, one of my mom's brothers who lived back in Pennsylvania, also used to send me like paperbacks of things like Dickens books and stuff. And one of them gave me Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass when I was in like 6th grade or something. That's a great book. That's a great book no matter how old you are.
That is a great book.
It has barbaric yops and all kinds of amazing things.
It's much more sophisticated than the Babysitter Club series, which probably would have been my response.
Oh, I read those too. My friends and I had, because again, we were like the nerds of Rock Springs. We had a little like library club where we like stuck little cards in the back of all our books and like lent each other all our books. And they were it was like a lot of Babysitters Club and a lot of, who's the lady that wrote a Swift? Madeline L'Engle. Anyway, lots of like those series that.
She did The Wrinkle in Time, too,
yeah,
right?
She writes grown-up books that are actually really good, by the way.
Well, so you've got this love of books, and is that something that led you down the path towards law?
Towards nerddom? Yes. Yes. I ended up... all right, so I'm going through the Rock Springs sort of school system, and there were a lot of amazing things about that, and also a lot of things about that were kind of tough. Like, it was not very tracked, and I was a little bit of a, like... I think I stuck out like a sore thumb in some ways in my hometown. Like, I just... clearly had my head in the clouds a little bit, like always had my nose in a book, like that kind of personality. Reading, like walking while reading kind of person, you guys can imagine. And so in high school, or in junior high actually, I got like put ahead a little bit in math and was going up to the high school for my math classes. Was going to have to start taking math like up at the community college. And then because of taking the PSAT, like some standardized test, I got an advertisement in the mail for my college, which is an early college. So it's in Massachusetts, very far away from Wyoming, and total like hippie situation. Like, I don't know, the ad was like a girl sitting in a tree reading a book. That came in the mail. I saw that and was like, oh, I too would like to sit in the trees and read books in Massachusetts. Nothing against Rock Springs, Wyoming. And called them, like worked up the courage to call the school, which I was like earthquakingly nervous to do for some reason. I walked across the street to the library and called them, and they there was a little box in the ad that said that they had this like full scholarship program, which of course like I wasn't going to be going to college at 16 without some kind of like scholarship funding. I called them and asked like when the deadline was, and I had missed it, and I was absolutely devastated. And then the woman on the phone, Jan Hutchinson, was like, well, we'll give you a week. Like, you can get your application in a week. So then I went home and I was like, hey, Mom and Dad, I'm going to apply to college. And they were like, I don't know, like, fine. And I did. And I got this full scholarship for my first 2 years there and ended up like going there. So I applied. I was 15, I guess, when I applied, and I started a couple of months after my 16th birthday. My poor mom was like, I just taught you to do laundry. Like, you just got a driver's license. And then I was gone. So
you go to college when you're 16. What was that like to try to deal with that socialization aspect? Because you're a lot younger than the other classmates.
And in a completely different environment too, because it's not as though I would assume the place you were at Massachusetts was a coal mining town.
Yeah. No, so it was actually, everyone there is starts when they're younger. So usually after either sophomore or junior year of high school, so like 16, 17. We also had Seamus Farrow, the son of Mia Farrow and Woody Allen, who's now Ronan Farrow, the famous journalist. He was in my class. He was 11. So he was the youngest one. But we were all sort of, odd, like young teenagers. More people from sort of East Coast families. Like there were a lot of kind of people that were like kids of professors and sort of academically elite in a way that I wasn't. Like they were all very intimidating. They'd been to all these like summer camps and like they all played the violin and I don't know. But it was socially, it was actually great because these were like my people, you know what I mean? Like this was it was nerddom. It was nerddom. It was so nerddom. And there were, math teams and poetry zines and like all the things. It was so amazing. So that was like hugely life-changing. Massachusetts was definitely a bit of culture shock, but we also were just in this little bubble on this campus, we weren't even allowed to have cars our first year because we're all, young. And so you really just were like on the campus with all these other students. And then these professors that were like mostly aging 60s radicals of various kinds, like people that have been highly involved in like Students for a Democratic Society and people that were political refugees from their home countries. Like, so it was a whole scene. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
So you're with this really diverse group of people and people that are all really ahead and advanced in their educational pursuits. Did that give you a lot of courage to try different things and really step out of the box?
Yeah, that's such a good question because one of the things I always say about the school is called Simon's Rock is that like I think if I hadn't gone there, I would have gone somewhere probably a lot more conventional. Like I had my eyes set actually on like the big like tech schools. I don't know that I would have gotten into any of those, but like I wanted to be like an astronomer or something like this, like something math and sciencey, which is obviously not what I am. And so I think I would have gone somewhere that was sort of more like classically prestigious and like, I don't know, had I gotten in, right? And instead I ended up at this like zany place and just that no one's ever heard of. I was off like sort of the usual track, and I do want to say it was diverse in terms of like there were just people there that had all kinds of interests. Like there were people who were there to like do modern dance, and people that were there to become astronomers, which I did not. And, but it was not all that diverse sort of racially or socioeconomically. Like it was pretty white and pretty like upper crusty. So I'll just kind of put that out there. That said, imagine like a school that has a cheerleading team that dresses in drag and wears gas masks to all the games to try to like throw the older soccer players that we're playing against, which was the only way we could win. Like, it was a wacky place. And it definitely has helped me be less of a like prestige oriented person and to just like do things that I think like need to be done rather than kind of staying in lockstep and going through like existing structures and just sort of like climbing my way up various ladders, which otherwise would totally be my instinct,
Did you get homesick at all? It sounds like obviously, you admire your mother and your father, and you had two sisters. What was that adjustment like?
Yeah, I was hugely homesick, and my younger sister Annalise, when I came back for one of the school breaks, and we had to drive to Salt Lake City to go to the airport because that's like the closest airport to Rock Springs. Rock Springs now has a fairly functional little airport actually, but not back then. And I was getting on the plane, and she was crying so hard that the guy then on the plane next to me looked at me and was like, "Should you be leaving her?" I was like, well, I'm not her mother. I don't know. Like, so yeah, it was a huge change. The bigger thing was that my parents ended up getting divorced that same year. And so that was really hard on my little sisters because first I had left kind of unexpectedly and then my parents were splitting up and it was not like the friendly variety of divorce. Nicoal, the family lawyer, is nodding at me. So, it was it was like a lot of family change all at once. But I still, in some ways, I feel bad that I wasn't there for my sisters that year and that I was instead like kind of starting my own life,
So it sounds like one of your teachers had a pretty big impact on you during your time there.
Yeah. So my professor, Barbara Resnick, she ultimately became my thesis advisor. I first took her class that was called Sex, Race, Class, and the Constitution, which I love because it was sort of foreshadowing for the whole rest of my career. The Bush v. Gore case came down while we were in that class, and she basically like took to her bed and didn't even like email any of us and like felt incapable of teaching us because she thought it was such a betrayal of like constitutional values. And I love her for that. Like she's amazing. So she became my thesis advisor. I wrote about, this was all during the time when America was like post 9/11. So America was getting involved in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and all these things. And we were all like taking my minivan down to all kinds of protests and whatever. And so you guys may remember there were a couple of people who turned out to be American citizens who were picked up like on battlefields in Afghanistan through all kinds of shady tips and whatever. And then who were dealt with legally by the Bush administration as enemy combatants, which essentially just meant like indefinite detention, no constitutional rights. It was pretty outrageous. So I wrote my senior thesis about this, and she told me that she would not allow me to graduate unless I agreed to her that I would at least apply to law schools. So it was basically blackmail. But she was definitely right. She was onto something.
And where'd you go to law school?
I went to NYU Law, New York City.
So how did you end up at NYU for law school?
Well, I had been in New York before as a junior. Simon's Rock encouraged everyone to get off campus for their junior year and go study sort of elsewhere. So what turned out to be 4 days before 9/11, I started a like international affairs program in New York City. And then the spring of that year, I was in South Africa doing just sort of like a standard study abroad program, I guess, but also looking quite a bit at their legal system, which I think parallels the American legal system in a lot of ways. So for law school, I really wanted to be back in New York because of all of the like legal NGOs that are there. And then also, you know, NYU was like the school that gave me money, right? Like a lot of us end up there. But I was pretty excited to be back in the city after my weird semester there in fall of 2001.
Sarah, will you explain what your love of the NGOs are? And for some of the listeners that may not know what an NGO is, can you describe what that is?
Yeah, this is like, you know, international people speak for non-governmental organizations. So it's like nonprofits. Yeah, I mean, at the time I was really interested in kind of international legal problems, I guess, like things like the international criminal tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. NYU had student internships there, which ironically, by the time I was in law school, I didn't end up applying for those, but that was part of what attracted me to the school. Just the idea of kind of like internationalizing law to better deal with like conflict and poverty and all of those things. That was sort of like part of what I was fascinated with as an undergrad, along with, of course, you know, American constitutional problems.
So you're in New York just 4 days before 9/11 happens. How did that affect your educational process?
Well, it was funny. When the towers actually were hit that morning, almost all of my classmates, we were living in this building together for this program, and then our classroom was sort of downstairs, and we had all of these sort of fancy like international affairs people teaching us different things, and they were all in a class with like a New York Times war reporter. I don't remember her name, but she just went into war reporter mode and like kept teaching the class. So I wasn't in the class, but they were all sort of like captive to her, and people were poking their heads through the door being like, you know, one of the towers just fell, and she just like kept teaching. But I was upstairs and got a call from my friend Emily, who lives here in Denver now, like checking on me, and I didn't know what was happening until I got that call. And that, so, you know, we were in the city, most communications were down, you couldn't really call out of the city, and we were far enough uptown that we couldn't really see what was happening. So it was this very surreal day where we would sort of like venture out of the building, and like we tried to go give blood, and everyone had that same idea, but there was not a real need to give blood because basically nobody like survived. Like we were trying to figure out if we could volunteer at a hospital, you know. And then when I first saw the actual footage was we were out like walking around the city trying to figure out a way to like be useful or responsive, and saw the footage of what was happening on a ATM television screen. And so that's definitely like burned into my mind. And then also like going down, you know, to the tip of the island in like the weeks that followed and seeing like that twisted wreckage and everything, like and the military presence in the city was also really intense. Like there were, you know, fighter planes flying overhead all the time for quite a while, and National Guard on all the street corners, and then the missing posters were like the other thing that you can sort of never forget. They were papered everywhere with just everybody's, you know, relatives and loved ones that you knew like weren't missing, like nobody was missing, everybody was dead. So it was a hell of a time to move to New York. Educationally, I don't know that it changed that much in a way. I mean, we weirdly, we were learning from, this was like exactly the kind of issue that we were there to like learn about in an academic way. And so it was like very closely related to all the things that these people were trying to kind of teach us about, right? And I was an intern that semester at Human Rights Watch. And so we were dealing mostly with, again, war crimes stuff in the former Yugoslavia. But it all was like, I don't know, very interrelated and felt very like sort of serious and consequential, and brought that group of people together in a way that we wouldn't have otherwise. Like we really, I think we learned a lot from each other that semester because of being where we were when we were.
What I want to know is a little bit more, honestly, going back to your family dynamics, because it sounds like to me you were pretty fearless in the sense that you're pretty young and thinking to yourself, okay, I want to go read books and trees. I want to go to Massachusetts. And that's not, I think, a very common sentiment for not only kids that age, but also kids from small communities, right? A lot of times the people from smaller communities stay in smaller communities. And so what kind of, was this just a fearlessness and adventurous spirit? And how did that impact your sisters? Was it kind of, were they maybe a little bit more fearless as well because they saw their sister going off to the East Coast?
Well, I think both of my sisters are more fearless than me, like by nature, honestly. But I will say, like, my sister, Caitlin, my next youngest sister, gave like a wedding toast where she talked about like the impact of her being 13 and her best friend, Jessica, who was like kind of another sister to us, like, and seeing me kind of like leave, you know, and just go off and do things. And that like definitely made me cry. But that said, I feel like they all would have done that kind of thing anyway. I'm just going to use this question as a soapbox to talk about my sisters for a second. My sister, Caitlin, for years was the development director at a workers' rights nonprofit in Boston, ironically founded by a lawyer. So she'd always call me and like complain to me about lawyers as though I'm responsible for all of our kind. She's like, you guys give each other so many words. But anyway, it was an amazing like small organization that was extremely responsive to like what grassroots workers wanted in Boston. So lots of Spanish speaking workers, lots of Portuguese speaking workers in Boston. And they achieved some like really monumental things like in a lot of different industries, including like the fish, I don't know if it's fish packing, like meat packing, but the fish processing industry and others. And so, and she's now in Phoenix doing like consulting around worker safety and wage theft and things like that. And then my sister Annalise is a social worker and has been for years with the Florence Project, again, also with a legal organization. And they essentially like represent people that are in immigration detention or immigrant kids in Phoenix, and she does like the whole social work side of that and has for years and is fluent in Spanish. And so they're both like much more like you should interview them, except they're not lawyers, but they're amazing. They're really good people doing really good things.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the stuff that you do for other people. What are the things that you're doing that help people?
What are the things that I'm doing that help people?
Or that you have done?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. So I sort of like transitioned through, well, let me start with this. My legal practice, where I eventually landed after law school, was wanting to do like civil rights and workers' rights work. And I have grown to like love that field more and more and more the longer that I do it, because I think it kind of goes to the heart of like a lot of the ways in which we have like skewed power dynamics in American society, and a lot of the ways in which our society and our legal systems like don't work for people. Like work is a huge part of people's lives, and people suffer a lot at work in this country, and have really bad things happen to them there, and don't have adequate remedies, and sort of have to work way too much to have any kind of life. So it connects into all these like much bigger issues for me. Representing my individual clients it has been like just absolutely like the honor of a lifetime. But over time also got really wearing for me, because we try to be very trauma informed at my law firm, and we represent a lot of people that have like significant trauma and oppression in their history, and that secondary trauma is real. Like that becomes difficult when that's your entire caseload, and when you're trying to like really show up for those clients and represent them well and thoroughly, and meet the needs that they have. And then in addition, single person cases don't really change the system, right? Like you're helping a person get a good outcome through the system, but you're not impacting the things that kind of got them into that place to begin with. So I've been in the last sort of 2 years, since I guess right before the pandemic, I've been instead doing a lot more policy work. My firm is now registered as a lobbying firm. And so we're trying to influence kind of legislation around workers' rights issues. I have done a massive amount of like political volunteerism. Like my husband rolls his eyes because he sees me with like stacks of letters at the kitchen table at night and everything. And he's like, okay, like you do you. And then I also, this semester, I've been teaching as an adjunct at the law school, which is really very fun, and definitely unabashedly trying to indoctrinate my law students. They're too old for that. They're much too old and smart to be indoctrinated by me, but it's fun to try.
Which law school are you teaching at?
At CU.
So your response to dealing with all these individual cases and the vicarious trauma that you maybe also experienced was, it sounds like it was twofold. One, that you gave yourself a little bit of space and maybe transition so you could help a broader group of people. But also you really kind of changed some dynamic and some focus to be able to change the system based on the lobbying.
So you make it sound like this was a plan. This was not a plan. This was me like dropping all the plates and everything breaking and like a huge, massive like burnout, hit the wall drama, basically. So thank you for putting it that way. It has worked out that way, which I think is kind of a lesson in and of itself. But what actually happened is that in late 2019, I was the women's bar president. I had my then like 1.5-year-old daughter. My husband's also a litigator. And I had my firm. We're a small firm. There's not a lot of us. There's not like extra places for the work to go. And it like was just too much. Like I was too sleep deprived, too kind of overwhelmed with everything that I was responsible for, not wanting to like let anybody down, and worked myself into this point where I started to feel like my brain was not my brain. Like I've never experienced anything like it, but I would be staring at something that I needed to write that would be like just like a demand letter that I could bang out in 2 hours or whatever, and I would like not be able to do it. And so, yeah, it was sort of epic, like bright lights burnout. I probably should have seen that coming for quite some time and been doing something about it, but I just hadn't. I just like had been putting my head down and trying to push through, which is, I think, what we always tend to do. And so I hit this point where I guess a couple of things happened simultaneously. One, I had a couple of big cases that unexpectedly like got resolved or went away that I had thought would be like in the heat of litigation over the coming months. And two, my husband came upstairs and sat down while I was like in the bath and like read me this like handwritten letter about how worried he was about me that he had written down because he wanted to like get it right, which was very, I mean, you have to listen when someone who loves you and is like the closest to you does that, right? And so I sat down with my partners who I adore and who I like. My partners and I've been through so many like life changes together, like having kids and all these like sort of really difficult cases, and they're like my comrades, I guess. And told them like something's gonna go wrong, like I'm gonna commit malpractice, this sort of can't go on. And they, again, like sort of validating all the reasons that I love them both as human beings, essentially like the next day had me off all the cases, had me off of CMECF, had me out of my email, like had just like taken everything over, like called all the clients, which they didn't really have the bandwidth to do, and so I will always love them for that. I feel like that was like kind of a life-saving move, honestly, and not something that everybody's partners at all law firms would have done for them.
But it's what all partners at the law firm should do when somebody's in that situation.
100%, right? And yeah.
And I want to ask you a little more about that part, because you identified that you had to kind of keep your head down, keep going, keep doing all these things. And so the thing that actually made it where you could take a step and evaluate what was going on was you finally got some air to breathe. But had you had those two cases not settle or resolve, you would have just kept your head down. And where would that have gone?
Yeah, I'm nodding because I don't like to think where it would have gone, honestly. I mean, I think I was probably headed for like hospitalization, quite honestly. Like it was panic attacks was kind of what was happening, and like really, really like metastasized anxiety. And I hopefully something would have given in a different way, but it would have been, I think, even like harder and on everyone around me than it was, right? Like there would have been even bigger kind of ripple effects than kind of doing it in a slightly more controlled, but still way later than I should have way.
Your law firm partners were very quick to respond. And so, you taking that step to say, hey, I need to take a step back here. That could be a lesson to other people to say, evaluate yourself, evaluate your stuff, make sure that you do take some time to recharge, because so often that's not what happens in the legal profession. It's push, competition, finish that brief, even if you have to stay up all night, I don't care. And so that's the difficult thing when we have people actually saying, I need a little bit of assistance. And they don't necessarily get that.
Yeah, and it's not good for anybody, right? Like, we're all limited resources. I mean, I would like to be around and doing law or law adjacent things, for a very long time. And I was like cruising down a path that it would have taken me even longer to sort of bounce back and recover. And I mean, and I've seen it happen to other people in our profession, certainly, right?
I know you're identifying that maybe you should have pumped the brakes a little sooner. But at the same time, I do want to recognize the fact that you had built a lot of systems, a lot of relationships, and a lot of support around you. And I do want to talk about that a little bit, because I feel like that's sometimes overlooked when you do ask for help. And the reason why you were able to receive that help is because you were intentional and you did open the right doors for yourself, and you did kind of create, maybe subconsciously, a system that would be able to support you.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said that, because that's how I feel about it all. Looking back, is like both my spouse and my law partners, all my partners, were really there for me, like really, really there for me. And also, I should say, like the women's bar too. I mean, I was the president of this big organization, and I essentially kind of like checked out for 2 months. Courtney was on the board then, and the rest of the board and the executive director, Kim, just, picked up for me in that space too. So like everywhere that I was, people picked up my slack, even though it was a lot of slack and it was not easy for them. And I like genuinely and deeply appreciate all those people for that time. And I hope they listen to this podcast and hear me say it.
Well, in that time, you were president of the women's bar. You had this thriving firm. You had a brand new baby. That was a lot of things to try to juggle.
I had a friend who's also a lawyer with toddler children, another lawyer mom, who said to me that even when you have a 1.5-year-old, you're still in the zone of like postpartum hormones. And she was just like, this sounds like postpartum PTSD to me, to a large degree. And I think I had not been sufficiently sort of giving weight to like that factor within all the rest of it, as like part of what contributed. Because my daughter started daycare when she was 4 months old. I went back. I mean, 4 months is way longer than a lot of people get. But by the time she was 5 months old, my spouse was in trial in Kansas City for a month, and the kiddo was in daycare, and I was trying to pump and pick her up, and you guys, do all the things, right? And I'd had that year, a year of that leading up to sort of hitting the wall.
So I guess in the context of, you've done a lot of stuff in your career. What do you think is next on your plate? Is it policy work? Is it advocacy work? Is it teaching?
I love all that stuff that you just mentioned. I think I'm at a point right now of like having a lot of doors comfortably very open, which is kind of amazing after doing such a specific thing for so long, right? Like, I owned my firm, I did the kind of cases that I did, And so I think, so one thing I also was able to do in the last year, thanks to not having like a full caseload and everything, was go through a training for women in politics called Emerge that's here in Denver. It's sort of phenomenally effective. Like, part of the reason we have as many women as we do in all levels of government in our state is because of Emerge. And there's a lot of like CWA women who are alumna. So I went through that and was really lucky to have a seat in that program. And I'm sort of thinking about that idea, like whether there will be a time and a place that's right for me to run for a seat. And the big caveat with that being that like I live in a part of central Denver that is historically Black and Latinx. And so I have to be very thoughtful about whether I would ever be the right person to represent like those districts that I live in. But I'm looking and thinking about that. I think that's likely something that's like on the horizon for me at some point. Also, I'm pregnant. I have to like get this baby out and deal with that. But and then beyond that, I think like, yes, like lots and lots of policy work of whatever kind, which is totally like new and exciting and just like so different than what I've been doing for the past 14 years,
I'm glad that you also just mentioned kind of the demographics of the area of which you live, because I also know that diversity and being an ally has been a pretty big, or at least from an outside perspective, my perspective, you have been such an incredible ally and an incredible advocate for diversity and diverse issues, especially over the past year and a half. With everything that's been going on with pandemic, Stop Asian Hate, Black Lives Matter. and, the social justice reckoning. So why is that important to you?
I'm going to go way up into like the academic clouds a little bit. And I want to thank you for like saying all of that, Nicoal, because usually I look back and I tend to feel that like I could and should have done a lot better at different points, like as I've been moving along, and I'm trying to keep like moving up that curve and doing better. But unfortunately, I think like for most white people, that is the growth curve, is to realize that like you could have done better in the past, and all you can do about that now is do better now. But I think the reason to me that like sort of the thing that ties up all the things that I care about together is that I think in America, racism and sort of like hypercapitalism and overwork are like very, very interlinked. And like part of the reason that we're okay with treating people like commodities is that we have like a history of enslavement in this country. Like it all goes back to like those bloody roots of how our country was founded and how our economy was structured back at that time. Like we've never escaped that economic model entirely, and it impacts everybody today. Like it's bad for all Americans that we have that like in our social structures and kind of in our DNA. That said, I also just like it really bothers me to see sort of the talents of a lot of people that in our legal system like kind of get wasted or a little bit pushed by the wayside. Like I see so many people pushed out by kind of the traditional structures of big law firms and things like that, who are just like absolutely talented and like have so much to bring to the table. That just like that sort of isn't right, so in the more immediate like law context, that's the way I see it. I also think that not only does representation matter, but it's almost like it's one of the most impactful things we can do to change all of these systems, because I can tell you that like sitting across the table from people from like every conceivable sort of background, any way you want to take that word, for again 10 plus years, I've been able to internalize things about other people's experiences that I never would have without just like being in rooms with them and talking to them and like actually understanding like what their lives are like. I'm like a white woman from a mining town in very conservative, fairly rural Wyoming. That's an extremely particular background. And if I hadn't had that experience over the years of just like being with other people, I don't think I would have like a lot of the sort of knowledge that I have today. So I'm like really grateful to my clients for that kind of education. And I think you have to have everybody in the room or that doesn't happen.
Well, Sarah, thank you. Thank you so much for coming down to the studio, for sitting 6 feet apart from us and having a conversation with us about, honestly, about you. I know that you have had such an impact, not just on the legal community and your clients. It also sounds like you have a pretty amazing, close-knit community with your sisters and with your friends and family here. So thank you for taking the time and for being with us today.
Thank you, guys. You're both amazing. I love you.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. We really appreciate it.
This has been Our Voices. For more information on today's guest, or to get involved, please check out the CBA podcast page at cobar.org/podcast. That's cobar.org/podcast. This podcast series was created by members of the Colorado and Denver Bar Associations. Our Voices is a collaborative effort of the EDI Joint Steering Committee messaging team, including Mallory Revel, Linda Moss, Bonnie Schreiner, Mallory Hasbrook, Mo Watson, Mario Trimble, Courtney Holm, and Emmy Lopez, with our CBA Communications Team Director, Heather Folker. Our recording engineer is Rick Ponteleone of Lionsbridge Recording. Our producer and editor is Courtney Holm, with theme and introduction by Mario Trimble. This podcast is made possible because of the support of the Colorado and Denver Bar Associations. On behalf of all of us, thanks for listening to Our Voices.